Hello, everyone. My name is Anthony Mills. I'm the Executive Director of Global Innovation Institute, GINI. GINI is the world's leading professional certification, business accreditation, and membership organization in the field of innovation. We welcome you to today's webinar, which is entitled Building New Businesses, the Holy Grail of Corporate Innovation. Our honored guest for this webinar today is Dr. Marc Sniukas. Marc works with senior leaders and their teams to drive growth, innovation, and transformation, working on such areas as strategic growth transformation, building new businesses, and strengthening strategic innovation capabilities and new ways of working, which combine the experimental nature of startups with the operational excellence of corporations. Marc is currently a senior advisor on innovation at Deloitte, where for several years he served as director of innovation. He's a professor of management and innovation at the Luxembourg School of Business in Luxembourg, where he lives. He's a faculty member at Duke Corporate Education, and he's also a member of GNI's Board of Advisors. Marc is also the author of the 2016 book, The Art of Opportunity, which addresses how to design and execute new growth strategies and ventures through strategic innovation. Marc holds a Doctor of Business Administration from Alliance Manchester Business School, where he led research on how established companies innovate and transform their business models, and also a Master's of Science in Social Sciences and Economics from the Vienna University of Business and Economics. Welcome, Marc.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, and welcome to everybody. Good to have you here. I'm glad to tell you a little bit more about all the stuff that Anthony just mentioned. So the research and the research that I did at Manchester, which also led to the publications, and which is actually at the core of my framework for developing new businesses within established companies.
Very good. And Marc, I know business building and new venture building, they've become a real trend for some time now, and they're certainly going to remain a major element of innovation strategies going forward. So I'm going to leave it to you now to tell us all about that in your presentation. The floor is yours.
Great, thanks. And maybe to the audience, so if you have any questions in between, feel free to put them into the chat. We can address them throughout, but then also we have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So why new business building? So as Anthony mentioned already, new business building has, it has been a kind of like an undercurrent trend for some time, but it starts to become a really more popular and big business. And you see that actually by looking at the big consulting companies like McKinsey, for example, who started doing a lot of research and surveys into new business building, into is it important or not, and how do companies do it, and what are the challenges that they face. So here is one of the quotes from a recent survey that McKinsey did with some 800, 900 global executives. And the clear answer from that survey was that so new business building is a top priority for organic growth at the time, and even during or most importantly, even during the pandemic. So we have seen lots of organizations who, at least at the start of the pandemic, they have cut down their innovation budgets, they have stopped their innovation programs, they have stopped their new growth programs because they focused so much on defending the core, if you like. And although obviously that's very important, I think new business building is also going to be a trend this year and continue to be very important, especially because of the pandemic and all the changes that we are facing because of the pandemic. So looking a little bit into the details of what McKinsey found, just a couple of slides as introduction. So it's a priority across sectors. So they compare it to a previous survey they did in 17-19. So you can see that every sector, basically, new business building is becoming more important. For some, the increase is more important than for others, but the overall trend is very clear. Why do companies look at new business building? I mean, obviously, first priority is to build new revenue streams, but then interestingly, it's also to adapt to a shifting customer behavior and shifting customer expectations, which we actually see also during the current pandemic. Then more long-term or mid-term, if you like, it's to protect against industry disruption, increase organizational agility, and lots of companies also take this as an opportunity to start experimenting with modernizing their technology architecture. Now, if we talk about new business building, lots of companies and lots of people think about building new digital businesses. And although that is a very important focus area for new business building, it's not the only one. And I'm going to share a case study with you that has nothing to do with digital, but it's still building a new business, revenue business model actually that was capable of generating billions in additional revenues for the companies that launched them. The results, so McKinsey says that those who are focusing on business building, they tend to grow faster. So obviously that's what we're looking for, but they also have greater resilience, which is kind of obvious because you are more diversified, so you can better react to volatility and any other dynamics in your market. But McKinsey also says that most companies lack the skills they need to be able to be good at and be successful at business building. And this is actually then where my research started off. So I was always very interested already many years ago in the question of how do established companies create new growth businesses, potentially also with new business models. And I got a little obsessed with the question, if you like. So I went to Manchester Business School and I spent a couple of years researching companies and getting a PhD in how do companies create new businesses with new business models. This research also led to two books. So Anthony just mentioned The Art of Opportunity, and most of the stuff that I'm going to share today is frameworks from The Art of Opportunity. And then there was a second one, which is called Business Model Innovation as a Dynamic Capability. So this is for those of you who are academics or more interested in the research and the foundation. So this is the more academic version, and The Art of Opportunity is the more practitioner and managerial version. And one of the case studies that I came across and that I investigated and worked with management to really think about how they did it is the German ProSiebenSat.1. So this is one of the leading German TV networks, also German-speaking Europe. They have some 30–40% of advertising budgets, market share in Germany. So what you need to know is that ProSieben is free TV. They have a couple of channels. You can watch them. Everybody in Germany can watch the channels for free, and revenues are generated by selling ads. Now, in 2012, they set themselves the objective to grow the business, grow revenues top line by $1 billion over a period of 6 years. Now, if you look at it, $1 billion is certainly an impressive number. If you go into the details over 6 years, it would only be like 10% year on year. So you might say, yeah, it's achievable. You have to know, though, that ProSiebenSat.1 faced particular challenges when it came to growing the business. So usually, if you want to grow your business, what do? Either you increase price, you sell more, or mergers and acquisitions. Typical 3 strategies to grow your business, right? Now, mergers and acquisitions, ProSiebenSat.1 is already a merger between ProSieben and Sat.1. So it is already a merger, a combination. There are only 2 big TV networks in German-speaking Europe, one being the ProSieben Group, the other one being RTL. So another merger and acquisition, very unlikely to be pulled off and very unlikely to even get an approval from the authorities. Raising prices also very difficult in this market. Why? Because the customers of TV advertising are big corporations, the Unilevers, the Procters and Gambles, Nestle, Coca-Cola, big automotive companies, if you like. Right? They are customers because they buy a lot of volume, they have a lot of negotiating power. And usually it's not even them buying directly, but they go through an advertising agency. Because agencies pool even more volume, it's not unlikely for an agency to have a discount on the list price of 60 to 70%. So again, lots of negotiating power, very difficult to increase price. So last strategy, you want to sell more. If you can't raise price, you try to sell more. Again, very challenging. In most European countries, the amount of advertising minutes that a network is allowed to broadcast on average per hour throughout the day is limited by law. So you have a legal limit on how much of your product you can actually sell to the market. So what do? Right? You can't sell more, you can't increase price. Where do you find $1 billion in revenues. So this is where new business building comes in. So question is, where do you find opportunities for new businesses that are going to drive new growth? And here, especially when it is about building a business for new growth, the key principle is to look at customers who are underserved, neglected, or unsatisfied with the current offering. I think that's not something new. We've heard that just before with Anthony. We discussed about blue ocean strategy, which is very much focusing on unsatisfied or unexplored customers as well. So what did that look like for ProSieben? I'd just like to illustrate the thinking with the case study. So as we said, ProSieben, typically corporate clients are their customers, and who is not a customer? Well, startups and small and medium-sized businesses. Why are they not a customer? Well, an obvious reason is they cannot afford it. They don't have the money, and that's the traditional thinking, if you like, in the industry was that they are not interested because they cannot afford it. Now, ProSieben started digging a little bit deeper, and they found that, well, there are lots of medium-sized businesses who actually could afford TV advertising, but they didn't want to spend money on something with an uncertain outcome. So they didn't want to run the risk of not having a return on their investment, if you like. And even those who were willing to spend money on TV advertising and who were interested, they said, well, we don't have the knowledge, we don't have the experience of doing this. So this is your opportunity. Right? You have a group of customers who are interested, but there are some barriers to consumption, if you like. So in this case, it might be the price, but there's also risk, and there is lack of knowledge or lack of experience and expertise. So this is your opportunity. Now the question is, so what is the offering? What is the business model that you can design? What is the new business actually that you can design to seize this opportunity? So how do you design the new business? And what I saw here is that, so you need to think about, obviously, your offering. You also need to think about your operating model, and you need to think about your revenue model. So if we further decompose that into different parts, so offering is all about the product, it's about the service, it's about your customer experience, which becomes increasingly important. When it comes to the operating model, you have to think about what are the activities that you have to put in place, what are the resources you need, actors and partners, so which of these activities and resources do you provide yourself, or where do you need other partners that help you do it? And it might also be worth thinking about the sequence of the activities in your operating model or your business model. You might remember the early days of Dell, Dell computers. It's always been used as an early example of business model innovation. And what most people focus on when they talk about Dell is that Dell went direct to consumers. So they left out the middleman, they left out distribution, if you like. What is less known, but what was really a key success factor to the Dell business model was they changed the sequence of the value chain. So the typical sequence was, at the time, for computer manufacturers, you have the source, you source your raw materials, you produce, you have to find an inventory, you ship it to a distributor who ships it to the shop, who then sell it to you. So the products kind of go down the chain, if you like, and then the money would travel up the chain because the customer only pays at the end, right? And Dell turned this completely around, because with Dell, you ordered your computer and you paid it already. And only then did Dell source the raw materials and the components they needed because you ordered them. So they didn't have any wasted inventory. They just ordered what you just ordered, right? And you financed the whole value chain. And because of this, so getting paid upfront instead of getting paid at the end, if you like, Dell had, it used to have, at least I don't know how it is now, they always had a negative working capital, which allowed them to grow that rapidly in the early days, because customers would really finance the whole value chain. So that's what I mean by shifting the sequence of the activities which can create innovation. And finally, you have to think about the revenue model. So, and I like to decompose the revenue model into revenue streams. So what do customers actually pay for? Pricing strategy, how do you set the price, and what kind of payment mechanisms do you give your customers? And just here as a little question to you guys, this is one of my favorite examples of an innovative revenue model. This is a French coffee shop, so a French version of Starbucks, if you like. It's called Anti-Café. The difference to Starbucks is that you don't have to pay, I don't know, $10 for your latte, but you get coffee for free. So my question to you is, and you might want to put the answer into the chat or your ideas in the chat, if coffee is for free, what is the revenue stream? Where does the money come from? I'm just going to give you a second to think about it. And yeah, as I said, please put it into the chat. What is their revenue stream? Rent of space, advertising on the cups, other products like food. You are paying for the time you spend there. Yes, Anna, you're Anna per hour stay. You're right. So you're actually paying for the time you spend in the coffee shop. So here is a Paris rate. So it's $5 for an hour, 24 euro for the day, and then you can buy a subscription of some 10 days or something like that. And I think the idea is so great because if you think about it, it is really customer focused, isn't it? Asking the question of why do customers actually come to Anti-Cafe? Why do people go to the coffee shop? It's not necessarily only for the coffee, but lots of people go to a coffee shop because they want to work there, because they want to use the internet, like Mohammed said, right? And why not make people pay for what they really value instead of for the coffee, which is in this case a side product. The other thing to think about is that I think it's also it's a great example of how can you make customers pay for your biggest cost in the business? Because if you're a coffee shop in Paris, rent is probably going to be extraordinary, right? So coffee is not that expensive these days. So the rent in Paris is probably very expensive, and so you can use that to make customer pay for your highest cost, but also what they value most. So back to ProSieben. What did ProSieben do? And again, be prepared to put some answers into the chat. So in terms of the offering, they said, we're going to give you free access to the media. So you actually don't have to pay for the advertising. And we're going to help you with media strategy planning and production. So what they did is they removed all the arguments that somebody might have to not do business with them. So no upfront investment, no risk, and they even make the work of taking care of the production and everything. So you basically have nothing to do. So no financial investment, no risk, and no work at the end of the day, if you like. So operating model for ProSieben, that meant so they had to build in activities for spot production. They have become and built the competency of picking the right customers that they want to offer this to. And that's what I call here target selection. I'm going to come to that in a minute. Specialized expertise, so for being able to do that target selection, and then they use some shared services for the group. And the billion-dollar question, where did the revenues come from? So if I give away my media for free, my core product for free, where does the money come from? Any ideas? And again, I would invite you to just put them into the chat. Media for equity, yeah, Mike. Mike is actually from Luxembourg. He knows the example. Hi, Mike. Profit from growth, yeah. Per user, per person who watched. So actually what they did is initially they introduced revenue share. So they said, we're going to do this advertising, and if our advertising drives up your revenues, then we're going to get a share of the revenue. So they media for revenue, they called it, or as Mohammed said, right, it's really based on getting paid on performance and getting paid on outcomes. Now, this was the initial idea. It was not more sophisticated, it was not more complicated than this. That's the idea they had. They did not go into all the details, operations, finances, all the legal stuff. At this stage, they did not bother too much about all these things. They just focused on, well, this is our idea. Now, obviously, if you have an idea like this, question is, how do you test whether it's a good idea and whether it's a valid idea? So usually, and most of you might or probably know this from your organization, so we do a lot of analysis. As I said, you do the legal analysis, the financial analysis, and so on and so forth. You do the planning, and then eventually you might come to implementation. As we all know, making plans is nice, but it's not really how life works. So what we see here is a much more iterative approach of you act, you learn from your actions, you create knowledge, if you like, and then you go on designing the next cycle of your idea. And so validating basically is initially 3 steps. So the first step is about thinking, does this make sense for you as a company? So does this idea of media for revenue make sense for you, and can you actually execute it? Second question then is obviously, is there a market for it? And does it make sense for the customers and potentially partners that you might need? And finally, then only do you come to the question of, does this really work in practice? What did ProSieben do to test whether there was interest in the market? They just issued a press release. So a very, very simple experiment. It doesn't cost you a lot. You don't need a lot of preparation. You don't need a lot of planning. You don't need a lot of people working on this. They just issued a press release. They said, this is what we'd like to do. Is anybody interested? And if you're interested, just get in touch with us. Right? And that's what they did. They got dozens of business plans, people who were interested, startups, small and medium companies, who said, this is a great idea, we'd like to work with you. And they just picked a handful to start working. Now, again, picking the handful to start working, there were no sophisticated criteria behind. This was really a new to the world innovation. Nobody had ever done something similar before, so they didn't know where would it work, where didn't it work, right? And at this time, it's just 2 guys. There was a senior VP of innovation who was involved, and some student who was just out of business school. So very low investment. So it doesn't really have to be something expensive or complicated. So they picked 5 different companies, and then they started working with these companies. And as they started working with these companies, they go through these cycles of acting, designing, and learning. And as you go through these cycles, the maturity of your new business idea obviously increases. This is what it looked like for ProSieben. So they started off with media for revenue share, no specific company focus, as I said. And they worked with these 5 initial companies, and they learned a couple of things. The first thing they learned is, well, no fee at all. It's not good because companies are not too motivated and not too committed with working with us. So they had to chase the startups, for example, to provide all the information that ProSieben would need to be able to create an ad and launch a campaign, for example. So what they said is, well, we're going to introduce a fixed fee. It was a small fixed fee, was very small compared to the costs of a campaign, but it raised the commitment of the partners they were working with, and it also shifted some of the risk from ProSieben to the customers, at least to make them also, as I said, more committed to work with them. The other thing they learned, which was quite important, was a focus on online businesses. So what they learned is that in some cases, like if you have an offline business, for example, they had an organic lemonade producer as part of the initial customers. So they made TV advertising, but they couldn't really track was the increase in sales due to advertising, or maybe it was just a hot summer day, and that's why people bought more lemonade. So they had lots of discussions and issues around that. The other thing they learned was some businesses, again, like the lemonade producer, there is an inventory risk. So they created a lot of demand, and then there was no supply. So they said, we're going to go away from these types of businesses, and we're going to focus on online businesses, because there they learned that they can track sales quite easily, and you can quite easily see that if you air your advertisement at 8 p.m., at 8:10, the clicks on the website and the sales on the website go up. So they could really track that quite well. And usually with online businesses, there was no inventory risk, so they could create as much demand as they like because the supply was there. So second iteration, they worked with a couple of companies, they did that. And then they learned, especially when working with startups, instead of media for revenue, media for equity would have been nice. They could have made more money on the one hand. On the other hand, when working with startups, the other equity partners, the investors, they were not too happy with the ProSieben business model. ProSieben would create additional revenues, yes, but then they will always take the cash out of the company. And that's obviously not something that, as an investor of a startup, you want to see. You're putting your cash in, and then ProSieben comes along and takes cash out. So they introduced this idea of media for equity, and now everybody was sitting in the same boat, and everybody was interested in increasing the value of the company. Some did it with cash, but ProSieben did it with the media power that they had. And kind of like the final iteration was they became even more sophisticated about who they want to work with, and they created what they call a portfolio of strategic investments. So they have become very strategic about which kind of companies they allow into that. One portfolio is, for example, all around online travel. So they have travel booking, hotel booking, car booking, rental cars. They have weather channels, weather websites in travel portfolio. Another portfolio is about lifestyle. So they have online shopping, they have online fitness classes, they have a dating portal, so everything around lifestyle. So they became really good at focusing on where does it work well and where does it not work. And just we had a question there from Vince in the chat. So non-digital clients, no, they really focused on online only. So they went completely away from offline stuff to focus on non-digital, on digital online businesses, because they could track revenues, and as I said, they didn't have the inventory risk. Now, something also important to learn in terms of business building is, when did ProSieben build the new business? So they started doing this, they started experimenting and going through these cycles, and that was a period of some 2 years. So from the initial idea until they said, now we have nailed the model, now we know exactly how we should do it, and now it's time to found a company. So that's the moment they created a dedicated company. It was called 7 Ventures. As I said, meanwhile, they have 7 different companies for all these different strategic portfolios, but initially it was 7 Ventures. But they only created it once they knew that they had something that was working. So maybe compared to startups who build businesses, here the business is only really created, if you like, the moment where you have proof that it works. And by the way, the only KPI, the only target that the group had was to show that it's profitable. So again, compared to traditional startups where it's all about growth, it's all about revenues, right? And you don't care too much about profits. Here, the focus was very clearly, the CEO demanded, show me that we can make money with this. And only if it's profitable, then are we going to further scale it up. So they founded 7 Ventures, and this is the moment where they scaled it. So here they standardized operations, they standardized the whole legal work and the frameworks and the contracts. They hired more people to be able to scale it up. And first they scaled it in Germany, and then they took it to France, and they repeated the same thing in France. So when do you know that it's time to scale it up? When is it a good idea? And one of the things that I learned is that it's when you create value for everybody involved. And so you have to create value for you as a firm. As I said, you need to create profit for ProSieben. You have to create value for your customers, obviously, but also you have to create value for the ecosystem partners, in this case, the other investors who were involved in. And only when they started creating value for all these 3, then the idea and the new business really took off and they were able to scale. So here you have again a couple of details. What are the benefits that the company got? So ProSieben got the advantage of obviously new revenue streams. They became also a little bit more independent from existing customers, which I initially said that they have lots of negotiating power. So they had now the possibility to negotiate better with them, because ProSieben had new customers and was not so dependent any longer on the traditional customers. They built this portfolio of strategic investments, and interestingly, they could also use the insights gained in the new business for the traditional business. In this particular case, it meant that usually, like Coca-Cola, if they increase their revenues through your advertising, that's not something they're going to tell you. So you actually never know how much revenues does your customer make from TV advertising. You assume that revenue is going up, that's why they do TV advertising, but you can't be sure. And here now in the new business, they had hard data because they worked with these startups, they could track sales. So they had hard data and evidence that it actually leads to an increase in sales, and they use that evidence to have a better negotiating power with the traditional customers. Obviously for the customers, so they get access to media, it's risk-free, a relatively low upfront cash out, and they don't need to deal with it. And especially when working with startups, as I said, so the other investors, they profited from the increase in the company value that ProSieben and the advertising of ProSieben brought. And nowadays, so one of the ambitions they have is to become the online leader in, or the European leader in online travel. So it's not something that they kind of had as an objective when they started, but along the way, so talking about building new businesses and emergent strategy, if you like, along the way, they learned that they can be really good at this, and they want to focus on that. And as I said, online travel is one of the strategic portfolios. Now, at Deloitte, we created a little bit more structure around these different phases of iteration, and we created a model which we call Venture Path, which basically he says that these iterative cycles that you go through, there are three big ones that you need to go through, if you like. And the first one is more focusing on the conceptual idea. So what I said earlier, the first step, does this idea make sense? And what we actually do is that along the way, we always check, does the idea make sense for the customer? Does it make sense for us as a business? And can we pull it off? So do we have the capabilities and the resource to do it? So if you like, if you're familiar with design thinking, so we always check desirability, we always check viability, and we always check feasibility along the way. But in each phase, we also have a dedicated focus area, if you like. So in the beginning, it's a little bit more focusing on this, what I call here, problem solution fit. So is there a problem? Does our solution address it? What ProSieben did with the advertisement or the press release, if you like. Then you build something, so it could be a minimal viable product, a minimal viable offering. So you experiment, you test with it. So this is a little bit more on the feasibility and value proposition. Can we really do it, and do customers buy it? And then you actually pilot the venture. So you build it out. For ProSieben, that was then doing the 5 first customers, and then you go in these iterative cycles. And what we also created is, so along the way, you have what we call outcome statements. So as I said, in each cycle, you test these 3 areas, these 3 dimensions. Is there demand? Is it worth it? Can we do it? But with an increasing level of detail and an increasing level of maturity. So as an example, in the first cycle, is there demand? You would just ask, well, the identified problem is real and compelling enough to a lot of people, right? Then in the next cycle, you would go into, still within the dimension of, is there demand? Do we understand really what the customer needs and what they want? Then in the last cycle, you would go even more deeper and say, okay, are customers willing to spend money on the solution that we offer? Right? So you can see that you go more and more into details, and you add more and more maturity to your idea as you go through these cycles. Now, big question, obviously, did it pay off for ProSieben? So as you can see here, in 2015, they already achieved the objective that they had set themselves for 2018 of reaching 3.2 billion euro in revenues. And because it was working so well, they actually had to raise their revenue targets every year. And eventually, in the 6-year period, they achieved 1.6 billion in additional revenues. And these 1.6 billion, they really come out of newly created businesses that did not exist yet in 2012 when they started. You can actually look at the numbers, the traditional revenues, TV advertising revenues, they are pretty flat, and all the growth comes from having created new businesses with new business ideas and new business models. So just to wrap it up, so this is one of the frameworks from the Art of Opportunity. So we go much more into detail on this where to place, so where to find an opportunity, how to seize the opportunity by designing your offering, designing your operating model and your revenue model, and finally, how to win or why to win by creating value for the customer, the company, and the ecosystem. A second key model is the process. So I focused a lot here on this evolution, so this iterative cycle of lean startup, if you like, of build, measure, and learn. But this build, measure, learn cycle is not everything to the story. There is something that happens before you actually go into this build, measure, learn, and it doesn't go on endlessly. So at some point you shift from build, measure, learn into scaling, what I call here diffusion. So in the framework, we also go more into the details of what that looks like and what scaling looks like. So if you're interested, I would invite you to head over to artofopportunity.net. So there you can find lots of downloads to learn more. We also have a free toolbox that you can download. You can download an introduction to the book. So we have the first chapter there. And if you're even more interested and you'd like to dive deeper, I'm currently in the process of creating an online masterclass. It's not 100% done yet, but like 30–40% done. So you can still benefit from the pre-launch sale price, which is going to go up once everything's finished. And then together with the Global Innovation Institute, we are also working on a new business building certification, which we're going to launch in a couple of weeks, I would say, Anthony. Yeah? So also stay tuned for that. And finally, yeah, so if you're interested in new business building, I'd like to leave you with the wise words of Master Yoda. Either you do it or you do not. There is no try. Good. So that's it from my side. Thank you very much. And now I hand it over to Anthony and to you guys for additional questions. I think there were a couple of questions there that we haven't addressed yet.
Yes, very good, Mark. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, so we're going to open it up now to questions and answers. So I would invite anyone who has a question, please type it into the chat box, and we'll have Mark address those questions as you type them in. I'll actually get the ball rolling with the question I have for you, Mark, and then as I'm asking this and you're answering it, maybe a few more will come in. So if I think back in time, I mean, you know, established businesses launching new businesses has been around for some time. In fact, if you read McKinsey's book, The Alchemy of Growth, that was kind of one of the whole themes, was launching new lines of business. And even if you go back to Clayton Christensen, when he wrote The Innovator Solution, he really advocated for keeping businesses broken up into small businesses, not one megalithic business, so that you know, each one's hungry. So this idea is really not that old. But if I look back in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, they actually had a different name for it back then. They called it diversification. And it actually came to be that diversification kind of had a bad reputation because so many businesses tried it and failed at it miserably. They had a horrible time. But in my mind, I see a major shift, a pivot, if you will, between how it was all done back then and how it's done today. In your mind, what's different about how pursuing new ventures is done today versus how it was done 30 or 40 years ago?
Well, I think one part of the story is obviously diversification. So as you said, if we think about diversification 40 years ago, it was really going into completely different stuff. Right? So that's why you have GE, who does medical instruments, and they also do jet plane engines. Right? So really diversified in that sense. So what we see here, for example, ProSieben, it's really their core business, right? And the new business is just with a different business model, but they leverage the core assets of what they have, right? In a very narrow defined field. Now you could say that's the same as leveraging core capabilities, right? But that's one of the ideas is that you still are in the core of your business, which, by the way, we also see a lot when we're talking about this other trend, which I think is reviving this topic of creating new businesses, is the digital, right? So digital transformation, digital businesses, and most traditional companies, they are not fit for that. And so they build new businesses where they still do the same thing, but now in a digital way.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think another difference that I perceive is back then, organizations tended just to, I guess they were a little arrogant. They just presumed they knew how to do another business because they could do one business, they'll do another. And they would just dive headlong with a lot of assumptions and a lot of money and jump into something and not know what they're doing. Whereas today, I think we've learned the cycle you were showing, you know, try, learn, repeat. And I think we've come to really understand and embrace more this you know, what was called validated learning cycles in the lean startup. So, you know, you try a little bit, just like ProSieben was doing, you learn, you apply that, you do these cycles. So I think and out of work like yours, you know, or industry is now learning, hey, we have to take this sort of cyclical learning process in there. I don't think that was around 30 or 40 years ago.
No, probably not. 30, 40 years ago was this analyze, plan, and then implement, right? And I think that's another element of this new trend of business building, is that startups, they work differently, right? And a lot of the methodologies and the things we do we take them from startups, right? And then it's corporates trying to apply that way of thinking and becoming a little bit more like a startup.
Very good. So I think we have a question here, a couple of questions on the chat box, if you want to take a look at that.
Yeah, so we have Anna is asking, what's the best organizational structure to launch this type of innovation? Is it agile team under the umbrella of strategic development? What would be the other options? Yeah, so I think here, I mean, there are two schools of thought, and it's a little bit of a philosophical question. A colleague of mine, Marc Sniukas, he's, for example, very much in the area of an established business cannot do this. So the idea that you cannot learn this internally, you always have to put it on the side, put it outside, have a dedicated team to create this kind of thing. I'm a little bit more in, so really going diversified, if you like. Right? So what Anthony just said earlier with the innovative solutions, so have small businesses and create them like that. I'm a little bit more on the other side saying that, well, you can do this internally as well. It's just really a matter of how to set it up. And something that I've learned in all the research I've done in the companies I've worked with is that really senior executive sponsorship, CEO sponsorship is crucial. So that's already the most important thing. Like ProSieben, for example, was the CEO who demanded we need something new. We need to find new ways of creating growth and we need new businesses. Right? And then he was also very involved in decision making and at least being available to discuss stuff and bring stuff forward. So I think that's something very important. And we actually had a question from Vince a little bit earlier about whether the model did not alienate the agencies and traditional customers. Yes, it did. Right? So there were lots of customers who would call them and say, "Are you guys nuts? You know, I pay you millions and now you give it away for free." So that can't be. So there were also lots of discussions there in terms of who gets the advertising minutes, the paying customer or those who are offered for free. Right? So lots of discussions like that. And here it was always then also the CEO who was involved in making the decisions and being the point of escalation, if you like, for these kind of things. Now, so executive sponsorship is very important. Then I still think that in terms of the best organizational model, so the team doing this, they need some freedom, right? And in line with new ways of working, the process and all these things, whether it's agile or not, that's not so important. Right? What is really important is to focus on the outcome. And here the outcome was show me that this thing is profitable, that we can make money with it. Right? So they focused a lot on that. There were other questions around legal, around as soon as they started doing media for equity, there were finance questions, right? If you invest in a startup, you have to put it on your balance sheet. What happens if the startup goes bankrupt and we have to write it off? Right? This creates problems with our banks because the loans we have and so on and so forth. Right? So lots of risk that was involved that needed to be discussed. But the organizational structure was always a small team, which focuses on resolving the challenges, focuses on the outcomes, make it profitable, eliminate the risks that I just mentioned. Now, what we at Deloitte also have done a lot is something we call Launchpad. So the idea that you have people from the business, they have an idea like this, and then you put it into a Launchpad. So it's an organizational unit that has the specialists who can help you drive innovation, who can help you design new businesses, launch them, and then it needs to go back to the traditional business. Right? I think this, in my experience, the challenge with this, let's just do it on the part outside, is that it tends to become very disconnected from the core. And then obviously, or very often, it also dies off because it's so much or so far away from the core that it's kind of like difficult to plug it back into the business. So I think whatever organizational model you have, this connection to the business is very important. That needs to be kept up somehow.
That's a great answer, Mark. And you know, kind of also looking at Anna's question, and you talked about with ProSieben, they had a small team that was set aside. They had executive sponsorship, and they had an outcome they had to show. But one piece we didn't touch on is, what was their time frame for doing that? I mean, did they have 6 months? Did they have a year? They have 2 years? I mean, sometimes it takes longer to get to that point.
I think so. The initial target was profitable within 6 months, and they had a profit target. I can't remember what it was exactly, so don't call me out on that. But they overshot that. Right? So they had very quickly like 20 million in profit, okay, which they generated. So, and then it was clear that, okay, this thing is going to work. And we should drive it forward and make it happen. And then they had more risk, so they had the discussions around, yes, I always wanted more profit, but I didn't want the risk. Okay, well, does that work? How can we mitigate the risk? Yeah. And then they kind of build upon that.
And you know, you talked about this small team needed some space. I absolutely agree. I think the other element, you know, this team has to be a group of people who understand this process you're talking about of let's get out there, experiment, learn, apply, repeat, experiment, learn. There has to be a group of people who have, I think, been educated on this process and understand this process because it's such a radically different process than traditional strategic planning. So not only do they need the sponsorship in the space, but they really need an understanding of this whole process and be able to apply this process.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I think that they needed two things. One thing is, and they had a senior guy, a senior VP innovation, who was very, very knowledgeable of the TV industry, the TV media industry, and he was very, very knowledgeable of ProSieben. So I think that was knowing the company well and knowing the industry well. I think that was something important. And then they had a younger guy who came out of business school, so he had been in a startup, so he was more familiar with that way of working in a startup and testing ideas and iterating to bring it forward. Right? So I think that's a key, was a key combination also to have these two together.
Yeah, very good.
Then apart from that, yeah, it was just two guys. It was not a big team. It was not a lot of investment, right? So it was fairly easy and low key on that side.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep the team relatively small and nimble so that they don't get bogged down in bureaucracy or anything like that, for sure. So I think we have another question coming in here.
Yeah, we had, out of curiosity, do you know how many other initiatives failed at ProSieben prior to this success? No, actually, I don't. I know that they experimented with a couple of things. Some of them that they were also, that they were successful in, like merchandising kind of things, creating their own content, which has become even more important in recent years. So. They are very successful in a couple of these things. When it comes to failure, something that I learned, and it's not just ProSieben, there was also other businesses that I researched and other companies I worked with. You don't focus too much on the failure and what doesn't work. So when it comes to experimentation, I know that we have been told a lot: fail fast, you need to fail in order to learn, and all these things. But what the successful innovators and new business creators do is actually they focus on what works and they forget about what doesn't work. Like ProSieben said, so physical businesses, it doesn't work. Right? We have problems, we can't track sales, we have inventory risk. So they could have spent a lot of energy on trying to fix that, but they say, just let's forget about it, let's focus on what works. So it's more a try and succeed and do more of what works instead of this try and fail and they learned from the failure, but they didn't try to fix the failures, if you like. And I saw that also in other case studies and other companies I worked with.
Yeah, and I think that's a whole part of the whole pivot process. I mean, when you learn that something doesn't work, let's pivot away from it and toward those things that are working, and keep pivot until we really hone this and refine it to a final working model.
The way I like to frame it is there is two levels of experimentation. So there is kind of like a conceptual or horizontal experimentation, which is about the different ideas, like Jérôme said, which ideas do we experiment with, right? And if something fails here, you just forget about it and you focus on those who work, those ideas that work. And then the second type of experimentation is more vertical experimentation and more operational experimentation, if you like. So this is really about, okay, we have an idea, we have some proof that the idea works, but there are here and there things that we still have to fix, like we have to fix the legal issues, for example. So this is more of a vertical experimentation. And I think that it's worth to distinguish between these two types of experimentation and know whether you are on this experimenting with lots of ideas or if you're experimenting with making one idea actually work. Another example there that comes to mind is Amazon when they started selling used books. So used books was one idea they had. And first, if I remember correctly, they had a dedicated store that didn't work. Then they had, every user could have a page with his or her own used books. That didn't work either. And only when they then put the used books next to the new ones, that's when the sales of used books actually took off. So this is more this vertical experimentation with one idea and trying to make that work.
Very good point. So I think Leonardo had a question there. I'm not sure if I understand it totally. Take a shot at it.
Just about knowledge education, but also about profile. So I guess you're referring to the profile of the people working on these ideas, if I understand.
Leonardo, if you want to clarify what we mean by a profile here, and Yeah,
Yes.
so
Okay.
the type of people, I suppose.
Yes, sure. I mean, you don't want to have people who are big on risk aversion, for example, right? Because you always you have to be comfortable with ambiguity. You have to be comfortable with yeah, complex situations, not knowing what the plan is. So if you put people there who are very planning oriented, they need to know every step and every result before they do it. They are not the best people for experimenting and learning from new ideas and new ways of working. So that's
So I think that's where, ProSieben had that individual working there who had spent time in startups. He had the startup way of thinking. So, he was the type of thinker that his mental model of thinking was one that fit with this process versus someone who's been in the traditional strategic planning role for 30 years.
absolutely. I mean, we're talking about creating new businesses, right? So it's very much entrepreneurship, right? It's corporate entrepreneurship, and you need that entrepreneurial type of person as well.
That's an excellent way to put it. And that's essentially what this really is. It's ultimately, this is corporate entrepreneurship, launching new lines of business. And so you need people who are entrepreneurial and who think entrepreneurially and who know the process, but certainly have the profile of an entrepreneur, or what sometimes are known as entrepreneurs, to help drive this type of business.
Right. Yeah, but you need that entrepreneurial mindset, that kind of like looking for opportunities and being willing to design something new and then trying out. So what, for me, the essence of entrepreneurship, finding opportunities, thinking about how can I seize them. You need that curiosity, right? If you don't have that, then
and thus the art of the opportunity.
There you go.
All right. Well, I think that about wraps up our time. With that, Mark, I really want to thank you. We greatly appreciate your time and your contribution to this community and everything you've contributed here. GI and I will be following up with all the people who registered for this. We'll send out a link to the recording of the webinar and perhaps some other content that you can reference.
We can share the slides. I think there was a question somewhere around.
Right.
Will you get the slides? Yeah, so happy to.
Yeah, we can share that as well. So G and I will distribute that to everyone. And so with that, everyone, we'll call it a wrap and have an excellent day and go out and look for new opportunities. Thank you, Mark.
Take care. Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Bye.